our show.
So 9 years ago, there was a police investigation into leaks that were purported to be coming from the Home Office. And 9 years later, we learn that Damien Green, Conservative Member of Parliament for Ashford, and effectively our Deputy Prime Minister, he has got some real problems over this, because whilst they didn't discover any evidence of leaks in his office, we now have an ex-Scotland Yard detective and a former Metropolitan Police Assistant Commissioner who've gone public, on the record, been interviewed, saying things like they were shocked at the volume of material found during that 2008 police raid on Damien Green's computer, and that they had no doubt whatsoever that it had been amassed by the Tory MP himself. So the story is there were thousands of pieces of pornography on his computer, and yeah, sure, people are saying, well, you know, he might not have broken the law in any way, but surely it's misuse of public equipment, of time. What was he doing? But I also think the story has become as much about the actions of those police officers. Is it right that somebody working on official business, looking at government leaks, who finds something else, makes that public many, many years later? And Sir Peter Fahey, the former Chief Constable of Greater Manchester Police, has said how uncomfortable he is with much of what's been said. My own view is that I think it's wrong. I mean, you wouldn't expect a doctor, would you, years later to reveal medical secrets about somebody, and I feel the same rules should apply to the police. But I don't fully understand or know how this question of confidentiality works in the police force, what the rules are today. So to help us through this, because it's important to get a real handle on what the rules say, Peter Kirkham is going to join me, former Detective Chief Inspector with the Metropolitan Police. Peter, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel.
So what are the rules, Peter? So let's just say you're a serving police officer. What are you bound by in terms of confidentiality?
In terms of when you're a serving police officer, the situation is very clear. If you breach confidentiality, if you make unauthorised disclosures, then you're going to be committing disciplinary and criminal offences, and we have regularly seen officers being prosecuted for criminal offences like misconduct in public office and things like that, and even going to prison.
Okay.
And certainly being sacked on a regular basis. There are officers, if they are found to have disclosed confidential information when they're serving, then they're dismissed. Fine.
So you are confident that system is in place for serving officers and that it works?
Absolutely.
Fine. Yep. Okay. All right. No, that's very interesting. What about retired police officers?
A bit less clear. In some contexts, the Official Secrets Act would be appropriate, but that, as far as I understand it, only applies to information that sort of impacts on national security and really serious matters. It's less clear in relation to other information that someone may have come into contact with or come into possession of during their service. I think all police officers, when they leave the force, sort of sign up to the fact that they're aware of the sort of ongoing duty of disclosure or duty of confidentiality, and we don't see huge amounts of stuff coming out into the public domain. There have been instances, and people write books and memoirs and things like that, even the very top cops. And so it's where you draw the line, because, of course...
Okay. Well, Peter, I mean, I accept, that somebody that's been one of the chief police officers in the country is fully entitled to write their memoirs. How they rose from being on the beat to the top of the tree. Absolutely. And of course they're entitled to write their memoirs. And they may have some fascinating stories. But I tell you where I draw the line. I draw the line that the police were in Damien Green's office in 2008 looking for Home Office leaks, and frankly, I couldn't give a damn what they found. Perhaps they found a case... Had they found a case of whiskey, they'd now be telling us he's a drunk, or... All of this is not relevant to the job they were doing, and they are releasing information. They're releasing information, very personal information, massively embarrassing a public figure. I think they've crossed the line.
In the normal course of events, if we were just dealing with someone who has gone to the tabloids and sold this as a story, for money or just for whatever reason, then I'd agree with you. But we've gone 9 years, and it wasn't done at the time, and it hasn't been done since. This is happening in the context of an official inquiry by Sue Gray, the Director General of Propriety and Ethics in the Cabinet Office. And my understanding is what happened is that Bob Quick, hearing that there was this inquiry going on into the unrelated matter that she was conducting, approached her and said, there's this information, it's about impropriety in the workplace. Would you like to know about that? And I understand that he then made an official statement to her. Not sure how it's got into the media.
It has.
Different aspect. And that needs to be looked at, and the rights and wrongs of how it got into the media. I do not like things like this being discussed in the media whilst they're ongoing. But that was the case. The second officer, slightly different matter. He'd not come forward. He'd not done anything with the information that he had, and then he heard Mr. Green very robustly denying that what Bob Quick had said to the inquiry was true, and describing him as discredited. And
this was Neil Lewis, wasn't it? Yeah,
it was. And so Neil Lewis heard that and
went on Radio 4's Today programme, didn't he?
Yeah, if you listen to his account, he was plainly affronted by the fact that what he knew to be, or what he knew to be factual, was being rubbished, and the senior officer that had been in charge of that inquiry was being rubbished. And he then apparently went to the inquiry and said, I've got some information that would confirm what Bob Quick said. They didn't get back to him, and he then chose to go to the media.
Well, I think a lot of the general public were plainly affronted about what he was saying. I mean, I'm going to ask you this, Peter Kirkham, up straight. Is it not time that we asked serving police officers to sign non-disclosure agreements that say that confidential information about individuals is something they keep secret, not just while they're serving, but for the rest of their lives?
I don't like non-disclosure agreements. They're used by the powerful to force people not to disclose things that are embarrassing or wrongdoing. And we've got the whole concept of whistleblowing. Although it's not officially whistleblowing, I would characterise what the two officers are doing as effectively whistleblowing. They're bringing something that they know to notice to an official investigation. If you've got a non-disclosure agreement in place, then we wouldn't have heard about the fiddling of the crime statistics. If you've got a non-disclosure agreement in place, we wouldn't have heard a lot about Hillsborough. If we'd got non-disclosure agreements in place, a huge amount of wrongdoing would be covered up.
And that's where wording them correctly is important. I was talking specifically here, about information about individuals where there's no allegation of the law being broken here. That's really the point, I think.
No, for sure. And you said you weren't bothered about what he had on his computer. I would say maybe you should be bothered. There's security issues there. We know that pornographic websites are totally infected with viruses and other stuff. It opens people to blackmail and things like that. So it is an issue, more than just what he was sort of watching. So there are some serious aspects to it, which I suspect is why Bob Quick chose to sort of approach the inquiry and say, look, nothing was done about it at the time. It wasn't decided to do anything about it at the time. But now, in the light of this other investigation about impropriety in the workplace, is this part of your story?
No, Peter, it may well be. It may well be that he was misusing public office. He should have been doing his job. All sorts of things that are raised by it. The broad point I was making is that if this guy wasn't breaking the law in any way, I really couldn't care less, as I say, whether there was a case of booze in the office or whatever it was. I just feel this is a private matter, and I don't think this should be in the newspapers. But listen, Peter Kirkham, thank you very much indeed for coming on, and we got a full explanation there about how the disciplinary procedure works for serving officers, and Peter was assuring us, that this does get dealt with. I have to say, I did an interview with the Metropolitan Police about 4 years ago. I was a potential witness to a case that could have been serious, and I read most of the interview in that following Sunday's newspapers. So, stopping leaks, stopping people selling things for money is never easy. But in the case of personal secrets, I don't think they should be revealed by former police officers either. I think we do need to have some form of non-disclosure agreement. The wording needs to be carefully thought through. That's my view. I wonder how Philip in Crawley feels about the Damien Green row.
Hi, Nigel.
Good morning.
Talk to you. Good morning. Yes, I was a lowly tax officer in the Inland Revenue 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And as far as I can remember, I had to sign the Official Secrets Act to say that I was not allowed to divulge anything about any individual outside my workplace. And I cannot understand why the police have not got a similar thing. And this Official Secrets Act also applied to me when I left the Inland Revenue.
And you were perfectly comfortable, Philip, signing it?
I certainly was.
And you've stuck and you've stuck to it?
Oh, definitely.
Right. Yeah.
Definitely. I didn't go around telling about different people, what they earned, and all about their personal life that I found out from tax forms.
And quite right too, Philip. And quite right too. And I think it's absolutely correct that you should have signed that, because you could if you hadn't signed it. I mean, goodness knows what you could say about hundreds of people. Stuff they're doing legally that should not be accessible to the public domain. So should the police, Philip, sign something similar in your view?
Well, very, very, I completely agree, because the Inland Revenue, I would think the working within the police force is perhaps far more sensitive with the information about different people they hold. And so I would have thought there's an even stronger case for them to sign the Official Secrets Act than perhaps all the tax officer, the Inland Revenue.
Philip, you've made the point absolutely beautifully, and the comparison. Love it. Thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:15. A big public row about our effective Deputy Prime Minister, Damien Green, and what was he watching on his Commons computer back in 2008 when there was a police raid to try and find out whether there were any leaks coming from the Home Office. And yes, it's been raised that it may be using, a parliamentary House of Commons computer raises certain security issues if he was looking at pornography sites. But against that, my argument is that he wasn't breaking the law, and whilst this could be something to be discussed internally in the House of Commons or with the government, it should not be being discussed by former police officers openly in the media. And to be fair to Damien Green, all this gets said, he is denying it and saying that it wasn't him. Now, finding out the truth of this is always very difficult, but the point is, should something like this be discussed in open forum? And from what I can see, from what I can understand of this, a retired police officer can basically say anything. A retired doctor can't say anything. And we had before the break a tax inspector, Philip, was on saying he'd been made to sign, the Official Secrets Act because he would not be able then in later life to talk about prominent public figures and their tax affairs. And that, to me, seems reasonable, but it's how you word it, it's where you draw the line. Maybe Simon in Gateshead can help us through this.
Morning, Mr. Farage.
Good morning. Good morning.
Can I just ask a question? If you yourself, and I have no doubt that you would never do it, but if you yourself were caught accessing extreme pornography when you were on the taxpayers' money out there in Brussels, would you not expect to be sacked?
You wouldn't expect to be sacked, but you'd be reprimanded, certainly. Yes. And there are some organisations, Simon, there are some organisations where actually there is a written, agreed code of conduct as to what can and cannot be accessed or done on computers or telephones during work hours. My understanding was there was nothing in writing like this existed in the House of Commons.
But Damien Green, when he was on Prime Minister's Questions the other day, actually said that he should have been held to higher standards, and he would, be perfectly fine to be judged based on those. And what he was doing was, in between sending personal emails, he was actually accessing extreme pornography. Right. Now, what kind of message does that send to the kids of the nation?
No, well, why don't we put some cameras in his bedroom as well at home and find out what he gets up to there? I mean, the point is, Simon, the point I'm making...
What he's doing outside in his bedroom, you know what I mean? He can do whatever he chooses, but he was in Parliament accessing pornography from a computer that was owned by...
How do you know he was doing that? How do you know he was doing that?
Based on the evidence that was given by this police officer who has decided to whistle blow.
Well, they can't prove it. They can't prove it.
Thing. No, he was there. He actually was investigating Damien Green at the time for accessing pornography on a
So as far as you're concerned, Simon, so you're saying that you believe that Damien Green's guilty, yeah?
Oh, no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is this man, this police officer, has the responsibility to call out somebody who's done something that is improper.
Okay. And how much should they sell these stories for if they get the chance to sell them, Simon?
Well, I would. That would be a very good question, and I would say that if there was any money given for this information, then that wipes all credibility out. But my understanding is that what they were doing was they were whistleblowing, and there was no money involved.
Fine. Well, that may well be right, but the point I'm making here, Simon,
no, but that's really important. You can't dismiss that and brush it aside.
Should a retired police officer be able to discuss?
Deputy Prime Minister. He is the Deputy Prime Minister. He's open for all kinds of.
So should we also have access to all his tax affairs, his children's school reports? I mean, where do you draw the line on this?
No. No, you see, what you're doing is you're taking an argument and you're twisting it into something that...
I'm asking you, Simon, you're saying that because he's the Deputy Prime Minister, it's fair for this to be in the public domain. And I'm saying I've got deep...
If I, as a public servant, was to access pornography on my work computer, I would be instantly suspended pending investigation and would face the sack.
So if you popped out to lunch, Simon...
No, sorry, Nigel, 2 seconds. So as an MEP, because you still go to Brussels sometimes, don't you? I know you've got like radios and all that kind of stuff, but you're in Brussels and you're in your office and everybody's gone for the day and you've still got lots of important work to do about how to rip out the European Union. You close the door, you lock it, you access pornography. Is that appropriate?
It may not be, but is it a matter?
No.
No, I think you're missing the point here, Simon. The point, Simon, here is very simple. If a retired tax inspector has to keep the work that he did private for the rest of his life, why should a retired police officer not be bound by the same rules?
Because it's called whistleblowing, right? And it's a very important thing that people feel as though if an injustice has been done, then they're able to call that person out.
Now, whistleblowing, in the sense that perhaps somebody had broken the law or that an institution was corrupt, I do understand that, Simon, and quite how you draft a non-disclosure agreement to take account of that, needs a legal mind, not mine. But do you see the general point I'm making? That retired police officers...
Not really.
You don't? Okay, fine. Well, I'm sorry, Simon, we're going to agree to disagree. This is not about Damien Green. This is not about what was on his computer. This is about what retired police officers can and can't do. And I think that really has become the issue. I take your point about what was happening at work. I understand that. And in many jobs, he would have been sacked just for that. But those rules were not in place at that time. I wonder what Claire from Edgware makes of this. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning, Mr. Farage. Well, I'm hugely reassured by the behaviour of the policeman, and it was beautifully articulated and explained by the officer who said that what had happened is this police officer found a colleague being denigrated and denounced, and that he was being told that it was all fictitious and invention and confected and all the rest of it. And he went to the person who was conducting the investigation. He said, "You should be aware that I found corroborating evidence on the computer, and it backs up what my colleague said. There was no, from what we are told in the public, there was no money exchange. It wasn't done for malicious reasons. It was done by an officer who still had a policeman's conscientious attitude to his work. And we in the health service, if we take 5 minutes from a pressing, hard day, go into the restroom, and we choose to access pornographic material, which, as everybody knows, is hugely infected with viruses and can bring down our system. And in fact, we did have our system brought down recently by some people say that emanated from Chechnya when we had that terrible virus.
I remember, we are
not suspended. We are instantly fired, and that is the way it should be. This is a member of the government. If anything happened to Mrs. May, then this man would step in as Prime Minister. If it became known widely that he has a penchant for extreme pornography, and it sounds like it was extreme, then he is very blackmailable, and somebody in the government must be held to a higher level.
Supposing Claire is innocent.
You don't seem to understand.
Supposing no, Claire, you seem to have judged him to be guilty. He denies this.
Well, of course he's going to deny it. There isn't anybody in prison who's actually guilty. But what I'm saying is, the fact is it was found on his computer, and also, what is important, we, other members of staff, are not allowed to access consultant computers. It is very, very clear. You use the administration computers, and you use the junior doctors.
Right. So you've got rules, Claire.
And I believe
you've got rules.
I don't believe anybody else was allowed to access Damien Green's computer but himself. And all the police are saying we found extreme, and I think that's important, because viewing pornography in of itself is not illegal. It's not looking at pornography, but the fact is the Deputy Prime Minister, it is alleged, was viewing extreme pornography on his computer, making himself vulnerable and highly blackmailable, and that in itself is unacceptable, and I applaud the police for standing up and behaving the way they did.
Claire, you've got rules as to what you can and can't do within the National Health Service on computers, and it's absolutely right that you do, and I do take your point about threats and viruses, and I get all of that. But I'm asking you, Claire, is it right that a retired police officer can speak about any prominent member of society that they've interacted with in their job as a policeman or policewoman, or should they, as with so many other professions, be bound, if it's private information about an individual, to keep that private?
In a previous incarnation, I actually worked for the Department of Agriculture. It was many, many moons ago when I was still a college student, and I had to sign the Official Secrets Act.
Right.
However, this is an officer of the law, and although he was retired, and it sounds as though he retired with full honours, and I highly commend him, I think he's a hugely admirable gentleman, he was aware of information that he wished to impart to the investigation. So therefore, he gave it to the investigation. He wasn't looking for any personal reward. He felt the investigator should know. And this has come out that a member of the cabinet, it is alleged, is viewing extreme pornography. That is of immense, of paramount importance. We, as a public, we pay this man's wages. We pay his expenses. We vote him there, and he must behave in an acceptable manner and to a manner of a high level of probity, because he's a member of the government.
I tell you what, Claire,
I don't understand why you can't see that, Nigel.
If you want high levels of probity, there'd be no one governing Britain at all. I'm certain of that, because you'd find something wrong with absolutely everybody. Now, this may be a slightly worrying case, but if he hasn't broken the law, he may have broken ethics inside an office, but if he hasn't broken the law, if you say because of that he's unfit for office, I literally, you'd get rid of everybody, is my view. But Claire, you feel it very, very strongly indeed. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC. It's 11:30. In the light of the Damien Green row about pornography he was alleged to have watched on his computer in the House of Commons, we're debating not so much that, but should retired police officers be able to talk about things that happen with high-profile people and put them into the public domain, even if they were legal, but could be personally embarrassing and could cover a whole range of things. And certainly my view is that if you are, whilst you're a serving officer, supposed to keep this stuff confidential, you should keep it confidential for the rest of your life. That's what I think, and it applies to former tax officials and to people who are doctors and many other walks of life. But first, quite extraordinary. Do you know there are 22,000 people who have worked for the European institutions, and a few hundred of that number have been MEPs. There are 22,000 people who are entitled to now, or at some point in the future, EU pensions. But it should be no surprise to you that 21,999 of them are of no interest to the press in this country at all. The fact they're called Kinnock and Mandelson and Patton and many others, all of that's irrelevant. No. What we must focus this whole debate on is Nigel Farage. That's very, very important that we do this. And I was asked back in 1999, when I went to the European Parliament, would I accept the salary? Well, the answer was yes. Actually, I was going to be taking a very significant pay cut to go and do it. And would I ultimately accept the pension? And I said yes. After years of this, and perhaps after I'm dead and gone, I thought my family were at least entitled to this. But that is, so I've been consistent on this all the way through. And yet, we've got Tom Newton down of The Sun saying that Nigel Farage refuses to give up his MEP's pension. He really did just say that. I've got the Mirror saying the same thing. I just find it quite extraordinary that I'm singled out every single time as the villain of the piece. However, I very much doubt I'm going to get it anyway. We are dealing in Brussels with bad people who act completely arbitrarily on money. I've been fined before for doing all sorts of things. They've currently given me a huge financial demand for something I can't, frankly, quite work out. I know one MEP whose retirement lump sum is not being given to him. If you support the European Union, you will get your pension. If you've opposed it, I think you'll be very lucky to get anything. Have a think about that, the Sun, the Mirror and everybody else, and look at the sort of money that's been taken away from people over the course of the last 6 months. But back to this issue of whether police should or should not sign non-disclosure agreements. I'm a retired police officer and I had to sign the Official Secrets Act on leaving, so I can't understand why this officer is saying what he is. Interesting. As a serving police officer, I'm appalled that officers breach the law in relation to privileged and confidential material, not to mention the laws involved. It is a basic breach of integrity within the organisation. Police officers should never disclose this type of information while serving or retired. And needless to say, I haven't got names on those. So there is a little bit of confusion here. Do some police officers sign the Official Secrets Act and not others? I don't know the answer to that. I guess that's all it can be. Chris is calling me from Fulham. Chris, how do you feel about this? And should the police be bound by confidentiality in retirement as well as when they're serving?
Morning, Nigel. I've quite a bit to say. We've spoken before. Just to remind you, I am one of your biggest supporters. I am a Brexiteer. I do understand what I think his name was Jean-Claude said in '56 when he said that the federalisation of Europe should always be hidden.
Yeah. No. Chris, we'll debate that another day, mate. But
so just to let you know that normally I'm completely on your side and waving your flag.
Right.
On this matter, however, we differ greatly, and you're in danger of becoming a comedic character on this. The police officers in question, and every police officer, signs the Official Secrets Act, the same as a soldier does. But that's the Official Secrets Act. That covers, that can be spread to cover what was divulged, but it's not normally. That would normally be a club hammer to open a walnut. It's not normally used for things like this. Now, as for NDAs, they only work for people that have multi-millions of pounds and in-house solicitors behind them, because you can choose to ignore an NDA, and as a individual serving officer or ex-officer, you wouldn't be able to take on the fight unless you got public support, because you wouldn't be able to afford to. What you've said this morning, what you haven't said this morning is that Damien Green should have been reported to the Ethics Standards Committee for what he was using his computer for. It should have been checked for exactly what has been said. Downloading porn opens up your computer to a multitude of viruses and infections, and your whole network is at risk. Also, the fact that he was doing it at his Westminster office. If he chooses... Allegedly,
Chris, allegedly. He does deny this.
Okay, well, look, I know for a fact, with my knowledge of technology, that will have been held on the Westminster servers. It's easily proved whether he did or didn't if it's put forward to the Standard Ethics Committee now. But what should have happened is it should have been, was it? I'd like to know, was it reported to the Standard Ethics Committee? Because don't forget why the police were there in the first place. Damien Green invited them in there to find leaks in the Home Office, and it backfired terribly on him. Now, I don't know, I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't particularly like Damien Green, but things could have been put on his computer to be found because he'd invited them into Westminster.
But Chris, we are discussing actually a different point. Yeah, I understand people are very exercised about what the effective Deputy Prime Minister may or may not have been doing on his computer. And we've had people who feel, you know, that he's basically morally shown he's not up to the job. Well, let's see whether he's innocent or guilty. But, Chris, the point is, when you're a serving police officer, you're bound to be confidential about people you interact with and not talk about them or their families or what furniture they've got or whatever it may be. You are bound as a serving police officer not to disclose those kind of personal details. Is it fair and reasonable that in retirement you should be able to talk about it?
No, that it's a thick black line under it, and it's no.
Well, there we are, Chris, because that's the debate. That is what we're debating. I'm trying not so much to talk about Damien Green and those computers, but more to talk about what should we expect of public servants. And I thought the first caller I had, Chris, on this, who was the retired tax inspector, who said he had to sign something, which means he can never talk about, you know, high-profile figures, tax issues. I thought that was fair and reasonable, and so did he. And that's my concern, Chris. My concern is that it seems, you know, and we did interview earlier on Peter Kirkham, former Detective Chief Inspector to the Met, you know, he did say himself that when it comes to retired police officers, the rules were pretty unclear. So I just want some clarity, Chris, and I do think that this leaves, you know, a lot of... I'm not just talking about politicians, it could be footballers, it could be anybody. It leaves a lot of people very open.
It does. I mean, when I say a thick black line under no, all right?
Yeah.
That is if it's just to write their memoirs, to make some money off a book, to do a tabloid story. If it is in the public interest, maybe there should be a committee that they can go to. If they have something on their conscience that they feel has been buried, covered up, hidden, whatever, that they should be able to go to a public interest committee that says, well, actually, you can speak up outside of the Official Secrets Act because this is in the public interest. In a whistleblower show.
Well, we need to have room for whistleblowers too, Chris, and I accept that's the weakness of the argument, is how do you draw up a contract that allows people to expose later on? It could even be criminality, you know, misuse of public funds. How do you do that and protect individuals? I'm not pretending it's easy, Chris, so thank you for your call. Is Green a friend of yours? You are getting crosser with this subject than you do about the EU, as was another LBC presenter who did declare his friendship. No, I'm far from being a friend of Damien Green's. I mean, I look at him as a very insipid career politician. I mean, if I listen to him on the radio or see him on the television, I just put my head in my hands and think, oh no, this is just too awful to bear. And of course, he's an ardent Remainer. It would suit me politically to say, let's hound him out of public office. I'm really not debating Green. I'm debating the rights and wrongs of what public servants can do in retirement. I think one or two of you are misunderstanding it. You know, when I say I'm not interested in what was on his computer, I'm talking about whether retired police officers should be able to disclose whatever they like. And I don't think they should. That's what I'm trying to talk about this morning. But I understand some of you, you know, take the pornography issue very seriously. Some of you from a security perspective, some of you from a moral perspective. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show on LBC. It's 11:45. There's an almighty row over whether Damien Green, effectively now our Deputy Prime Minister, did or did not access pornography on his House of Commons computer. This was talked about in the last few days by retired police officers who were there looking for leaks that were occurring from the Home Office. And in fact, Damien Green had actually invited them in the first place. But I'm not discussing Damien Green and pornography on his computer. He hadn't broken the law. He may or may not have broken standards within the House of Commons. Of that, we're not clear. But I'm not discussing that, folks. I'm discussing whether retired police officers should be subject to non-disclosure agreements so they cannot reveal private things about individuals in their retirement. And I feel very strongly that they should. Against that, you know, I get people saying to me, well, look, what about whistleblowers? What about uncovering genuine wrongdoing? Well, I think here I've got a little bit of help, because Joe in New Cross says the following. He says, Nigel, first-time texter here. As an employment lawyer, It is incredibly common for all normal employment contracts to have confidentiality provisions which say that employees can't disclose confidential information about the employer or its clients' contacts, even after they have left. They have standard carve-outs for proper whistleblowing purposes, i.e. where they're aware a legal breach is happening. Very odd, in my view, that police officers don't have something similar. Joe in New Cross, employment lawyer, thank you for that. So Joe says actually in many walks of life this is normal, and there he's referring more to the private sector, but we know from the former Inland Revenue Inspector who rang us earlier on this morning that it's pretty normal there too. Jean says to me on Facebook, an ex-policeman should not be telling the press media anything he knows that could be used in court. Innocent until proven should still apply. The coverage does not help. Alan says, fan of yours, Nigel, you're wrong on this one. Damien Green holds one of the highest roles in government and his office must be seen to be wider than what. Alan, I'm not talking about Damien Green. I'm talking about the role of public servants and police officers, and that's really what I'm trying to take the debate. But I understand that this is a very emotive point on its own. I am no fan of Damien Green at all. He is, one of the almost Remainer in chief. Well, he and Hammond, I suppose, compete for that within the cabinet, and he represents all the mediocrity of career politics to me. But I do somehow feel he's caught up in something that I'm not sure should be in the public domain. Some of you think that's wrong, but should those police officers be allowed to say this and do this? I wonder what John from Glasgow thinks. John, good morning.
Nigel, the Damien Green case was deemed non-criminal and not a police matter almost a decade ago.
Yes.
And as such, what's happened here is completely outrageous. If there's any prosecutions, it should be this retired police officer that should be getting prosecuted. Because I, as a 19-year-old weekend soldier 30-odd years ago, was made to sign the Official Secrets Act even then. And if they're not doing that now in the police force, then somebody clever obviously decided that they didn't need to bother anymore. Well, they do. But really, the crux of what I want to say here is that what we're getting here is the start of the blowback from the politicisation of the police force, which has been going on for almost 10 years. You've got the Mayor of London involved in policing. You've got police and crime commissioners, elected officials in England. We've had politicisation here in Scotland. The regional forces have been done away with. Police Scotland has been set up. They want to do away with British Transport Police. And, of course, when you start blurring the lines between policing and politics, you get policemen who then have grudges against politicians, and this is part of this.
John, I do understand your point. I mean, I think much of the public sector got politicised during the Blair years, but whether that had happened or not, you would still have retired police officers who would have political grudges. They might be on the left, they might be on the right. These things work both ways. But why, John? Why? When we spoke earlier on in the programme to a retired senior policeman, why have the police not got something in place? I mean, you said yourself, as a Territorial Army soldier, you had to sign something. What's gone wrong here?
Well, I suspect it's probably just something that they've stumbled into, and like many things in life that are actually important, somebody clever somewhere has said, we just don't need to bother with that anymore. Probably this guy hasn't signed the Official Secrets Act, but if they haven't, and it's hit or miss all over the place, that's the first thing. The first time somebody who signs up even for the Territorial Army and the police force should be asked.
No, I take that point, John. I absolutely take that point. I thank you for the call. Graham from Bushy says to me on Twitter, when you leave your employment, you must hand back all documents, notebooks and records that you obtained during the course of your employment. So why have the police officers breached this? And yes, absolutely, I do agree with that point very, very strongly. Mark is calling me from Nottingham. Good morning, Mark.
Morning, Nigel. I'm a retired police officer,
right.
And I have to say that it goes actually a lot to the character and credibility and their own standards of the police officers or retired police officers who've done this. I and many of my colleagues have been involved in many types of incidents. I wouldn't dream of exposing information that was not didn't need to be exposed, was not part of an investigation. And, I question, if this is 10 years ago, why has it come out now? Because Damien Green is now the Deputy Prime Minister.
Yes.
He's in a position where Bob Quick can get his own back because he had to resign because of what he did back in 2009. I think I smell a rat, and police officers, in my experience, aren't given advice about what you can and can't say when you retire, but it's common sense. It's your own standards. It's your own...
Mark, you know, just as I've said that Damien Green may be entirely innocent, you know, we mustn't question... I mean, I'm not going to allow Bob Quick's motives to be questioned without him having right of reply. But, Mark, as a retired police officer, tell me, what are you bound by? Did you sign the Official Secrets Act? What did you sign when you served? And what applies to you now as a retired police officer?
I signed the Official Secrets Act
Right.
when I joined, and you sign an employment contract, and that employment contract and the Official Secrets Act doesn't terminate. It's related to the information that you become, you get hold of, you're aware of during your service. And my assumption is, because to be honest, I wasn't told when I retired, that it continues, and that's what police officers do.
And this is why it's grey, Mark, isn't it? Very great. Listen, thank you, Mark. I've got to move on. I've got time for one quick last call. Gordon, we haven't got long, from Slough in Berkshire. Good morning.
Good morning to you, Nigel. Thank you for taking my call. As somebody who retired in comparatively recent times, it's been a very interesting debate. And yes, you do get reminded with another form at the end of your service around the Official Secrets Act. But surely here I'd suggest to you, Nigel, the issue is one of political integrity. And your previous caller was quite right saying that policing has been politicised. But this is one of public interest. The position this man holds and the way he's tried to paint himself in the eyes of the public and put down the police, effectively. I don't suggest it's point scoring on the part of the officer that's raised his head above the parapet. What I would suggest is it's one of integrity. And he's calling out the integrity of Damien Green around the way he's chosen to paint himself as a political figure. And this issue, therefore, surely must be in the public interest.
OK, well, he is Deputy Prime Minister. What he did would be a breach in most work organisations, though it doesn't look like those rules were in place in the House of Commons, and I understand that. Is it a matter of public interest? Well, anything about an individual is a matter of public interest. It's the fact that it wasn't illegal, Gordon, I think that perhaps causes me the most concern. But listen, I thank you for the point. Well, it's a subject that's raised some very, very strong emotions. A lot of you think Green was entirely wrong if he's guilty of viewing pornography on a Commons computer. I still feel that former police officers should be bound by confidentiality, not just during their service, but when they've retired too. You've been listening to The Nigel Farage Show on LBC. I'm back tomorrow night at 7. Coming up at 3 this afternoon, it's Alex Salmond. But up next, it's Martin Stamford.
Nigel, thank you. Today is